Hi, I'm Michael Otey, Senior Technical Director for Windows IT Pro Magazine, SQL Server Magazine, and DevPro Connections. And I'm here at TechEd 2011 with Andy Kelly. Andy, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks Mike. My name's Andy Kelly and I'm a mentor with SolidQ, and I specialize in performance tuning, scalability, optimization. Been working with SQL Server for quite a while now, and I'm also a SQL Server MVP since 2001.
Cool. So Andy, there's been a lot of enhancements in today's new server platforms. A lot of changes in disk drives, a lot of enhancements with memory, scalability, processors. What are some of the things that customers should be looking at when they're getting a new server, and how does it kind of affect the performance they might get out of SQL Server?
It's a good question. The change in the hardware these days have really, in my opinion, have really changed how people should be looking with SQL Server. It used to be that hardware was expensive, you had to skimp on a lot of things, and today hardware is much cheaper and it's much easier to get a very well-performing system.
Right.
Things like memory especially. Memory is probably one of the cheapest investments you can make to help performance these days with SQL Server. If you don't have enough memory, you're relying on the I/O subsystem, and the more you can keep in the cache, the better off you are. And systems are just, our memory is so inexpensive these days, it just doesn't pay not to spend a few $100s and get the memory that you need.
Right.
The machines themselves are also much better. You can now get quad core, 6-core, 8-core processors, and with the licensing being at a processor, not at the core level,
right.
It also again makes it very easy for the smaller companies to get better processing power without actually having to pay more money. So the advancements in the hardware in the last couple of years have made a big change in how people are using SQL Server. They're able to get much better performance out of less expensive systems.
Sure.
And my role as a consultant, I'm a performance consultant, I like to see these hardware changes. It may not be good for my career, when they can do that, but the point is that people should not be looking at the hardware to fix all their problems, though.
Oh, sure.
That is one of the things that now, with all the extra processors and such, people tend to think, well, we'll just throw hardware at the solution.
Right.
And that's almost never the right choice these days.
Well, it doesn't help if you don't have enough hardware, but once you get to a certain point, sometimes throwing more hardware at a problem doesn't really help it.
Exactly. You really should take advantage of the hardware, but make sure that you've designed your application properly, your database properly, so that it scales when you need it to scale on that.
Before we leave the topic of hardware, what do you think about SSDs? They're kind of a new technology in the storage line. How can SQL Server professionals take advantage of those things to help their system performance?
That's another good question. Solid state devices have also somewhat revolutionized how things can be done with SQL Server. I'll take a real life example of one of my clients who had it's a large data warehouse, and of course they have large queries that have to utilize TempDB. And we were seeing average latencies in the 400 to 1,000 millisecond range, average latencies for TempDB.
Right.
And that just slows everything down, anything that needs TempDB, it just slows it down.
Because everything has to wait for that and those latencies? Yeah.
So we were able to put in some solid state drives and used for TempDB, both the data and the log file, and those latencies are essentially gone. They're less than a millisecond now.
Wow!
So that was a
big
dramatic difference, and they're getting much cheaper. So the average consumer can now start taking advantage of SSDs.
Right.
That's another area where I think we're going to see a rapid growth in the next year or two on that.
That's good. So as you do work with different companies in the performance area, what are some common mistakes that you see out there? What are things that a lot of companies do that you see over and over again that are mistakes, or things that are holding back the performance on their systems?
Okay. One of the biggest mistakes is the way that they develop the application and the way it makes the calls to the database. They don't get good plan reuse. They'll dynamically generate the code on the front end.
You mean by using dynamic SQL?
Yeah, well, either dynamic SQL or their application tier will generate the SQL, like the select statement, the where clause, everything will be generated, and then it'll be sent across as just a select statement versus using store procedure calls or parameterized queries.
Gotcha.
And that leads to lack of plan reuse, and so that every time they make a call to the database, they have the potential that they have to compile a new plan for that. And compiling plans and then storing them and looking them up is very resource intensive. And if you're not doing that correctly, you're never going to get peak performance. and the more you want to scale, the more that's going to hurt you.
Right. And so by getting this plan reuse, those plans are already stored out there in the procedure cache, so SQL Server can just use them right away, and it doesn't have to recompile them or recreate them every time the query is submitted to the engine.
Exactly. It's most of the hard work is done. It just now has to run it. It doesn't have to figure out how to run it anymore.
Right. That does sound like a key step towards really making it more optimal. But it's an application kind of change.
Yes, that is absolutely an application change.
It is kind of surprising how many of the performance things do come out of application type coding and other kinds of optimizations there.
As a consultant, I see this all the time, and the majority of the time you can pretty much count on the application being a significant factor in the overall performance on that. And then the other thing that's pretty common is a lack of a proper storage subsystem, meaning that they either don't have enough individual drives to back up what they're trying to do, or it's not configured properly. And so the I/O or the storage is typically your next biggest bottleneck. Well,
that would make sense, since that's probably what you're going to spend most of your time waiting for, or SQL Server will spend its time waiting for as the storage. Is there a certain type of storage subsystem, like iSCSI, Fiber Channel, other things like that, or other configuration tips that might help out some readers and as they implement these things?
Well, the different types, I mean, they all work. They all have their pros and cons. Whatever the iSCSI is getting more popular. It's less expensive, so a lot more people are using it. But it's not necessarily as performant as say a Fiber Channel type thing. The best advice I can give is still think about what you're going to be using your database for. What kind of I/O that you expect to, excuse me, kind of I/O that you expect to be running against the storage subsystem, and just make sure that it is sized appropriately. There's white papers and such. The SQL Cat team has a number of white papers on sizing your I/O and making sure you get that done right up front, and that's true regardless of the type of subsystem that you use on there.
Right. As you go into a customer and you go to track down a performance problem, is there a certain methodology that you use, or there some things that you look at first and then work your way through it? I know it can be a complex topic, and you do whole workshops on this kind of thing that you do for SQL Server Magazine as you go around, so I know it's probably more than we can get into right now, but what are some of the general approaches that you take?
Well, the place I go to almost always, right off the bat, is looking at the wait statistics. The wait statistics are going to tell you what SQL Server was waiting on throughout a certain time period. You take snapshots, and if you want to know what SQL Server is waiting on, you look at the wait statistics. Okay. And that's going to give you your best idea of where you should start looking for your problems, because you just go in and say, okay, well, I think there might be disk problems, or I think maybe it's CPU or this, that. You could be chasing your tail, chasing the wrong problem. The wait statistics will tell you exactly what you're waiting on, whether it is disk or whether it's memory or whether it's CPU or whatever the case may be. So I always recommend starting with the wait statistics on that.
Well, that sounds like good advice. What are some of the tools that you use when you do this? Do you use performance counters? Do you use trace?
I use both those. I capture perfmon counters, and I run certain types of traces. I do usually doing it like an exploratory trace, so I can see what's going on in the system, and then I will narrow that down and filter it to get just the type of things I'm looking for. But I also use the things that come internal with SQL Server, the dynamic management views. There's a lot of information to be had from just looking at what SQL Server's collecting on its own through that. So I use the combination of those, and I use my own homegrown tools or queries to do this. There's nothing magical about anything that I do. Anybody could use that. As a matter of fact, in the workshops that I do, I give them the same tools that I use because they've worked for me all these years. Well,
that's a nice benefit. So. You probably tell them how to use them too.
Yes.
Which is always a bonus. Yes. But it seems like, performance problems are something that happen after the application is written, and it sounds like one of the best ways to avoid them is to make sure that everything is written with an eye to performance from the very start.
Absolutely. A good design up front when it comes to scalability and performance is invaluable. If you look at it later when you start to have problems, it's a lot of times it's too late to do the things that you need to do to really make it perform right, because it's in production. Sometimes there's limited things you can change. So the best time to do it is before you get to that point.
Sure. That is always the ideal, but of course you can't always do that, because a lot of times you're the DBA is put in the position of supporting an application that's purchased externally or comes from another source, and they just have to try to deal with it as best they can.
Yes, yes, especially when it's third-party software that they've bought, they have to use, but they can't make many changes on it. There's very limited things they can do in that respect, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Well, that was a lot of great information. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Terrific information, and have a great tech ed.
Okay, thanks, same to you.